Deus in adjutorium meum intende. Is here now, the supreme folly. This is its hour. One does not carry arms into God's house. What do you want? Your death. We will continue the service. Excellent. Don't! Traitor! How heavy thy honor is to bear.
So that was the 1960s Becket movie version of Thomas Becket's assassination, really. Murder. Martyrdom is what Christians called it in the Middle Ages. It happened on December 29th, 1170. And if you look at the image there in the medieval manuscript, you can see you can actually see the brother like the movie, right? As far as I remember, he was not killed as portrayed in the movie, but there might be different records of that. Also, you can see they didn't show this part in the movie. It's probably maybe too gruesome. Maybe didn't have the effects to show it at the time. But in most images, you have him being hit in the head. And I think the sources say that too, that they actually basically lopped off the top part of his head, which again would be an effective way to kill somebody, right? But you have the knights. This did happen. These knights went sort of on the orders of Henry II, the king. It turned out to be obviously bad for Thomas Becket because he dies. But Thomas Becket is proclaimed a saint pretty quickly. He's a martyr, proclaimed a saint. And the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury, Canterbury is in southwest England. It's the Archbishopric of Canterbury there. The shrine of Thomas Becket becomes the most visited place in late medieval England until the 1500s, when under Henry VIII it was dissolved. So, and you might have heard of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's connected to that too. Some of you probably read that or part of it at some point. So let's go back and look at the map here again. I was explaining Henry II and his importance. So I talked about this in the last slide. So there they are. Henry II was not just the King of England up here. He also controlled through his dynastic inheritance in one way or another, and through marriage, this area, the whole western part of France. So technically, he was the vassal to the King of France. This is the King of France's royal domain here. There's Paris. But in reality, he was more powerful than the King of France, and they were great rivals, the French and the English kings at this point. But this shows you that that's why it's called the Anglo-Norman world, because the Normans who started here, of which he was the descent, he was the great-grandson of William the Conqueror, ruled on both sides during this time. So that's very significant. So this is often known as the Angevin Empire. That was their family name, the Angevins. So there they are arguing against, there's Becket's murder. So what about Henry's descendants? Well, when Henry died in 1189, one of his sons became king. Eleanor was quite good at having children. I'd have to look up how many children she had, and she lived a very long time. And she had a number of children, at least 3 sons, maybe 4. And they were rivals often among themselves. But the son who lives long enough and becomes king after Henry is the pretty well-known king. I would argue maybe the most well-known king of England in the Middle Ages. I would say, probably take the maybe out. I would say he was the most well-known king in the Middle Ages. Mostly, we're going to be talking about the Third Crusade in another video, but in another lecture. But I'll mention a few things about Richard here. Yeah, as I said, he did go on the Third Crusade. And in fact, most of Richard's life he spent in France. He was in that whole northern French territory that I showed you on the map there. And his mother, I think, favored him most. So Henry and Eleanor, as they got older, had a bit of a falling out. She was actually under house arrest for much of her time being married to Henry. And she basically kind of plotted against him with Richard at different times, and the sons kind of fought each other and all this. So there's a great movie, fictional depiction of this called The Lion in Winter. If you want to look it up, it's a pretty good movie. So Richard is most well known, as I said, for the Third Crusade, and we'll be talking about the Third Crusade in our Crusades lectures. But he spent a lot of time fighting in France. He spent more time fighting in France, frankly, even before he was king. And Richard really was the medieval knight. He was the great example of the medieval knight. He was the greatest warrior of his time. At least many people would have argued that. Maybe there's arguments for others. He was known as a good general, a good leader, and he displayed that in the Third Crusade. And he could be very cruel and ruthless when he needed to be, and we'll give some examples of that. One of the sources says that Richard liked to try to hack his enemies down, basically down through their head, down all the way through their skull with one blow. And there are other sources that talk about knights hacking people's limbs off and all these things. So now, ironically, Richard died while he was besieging a castle in 1199 in France. He died he got hit by kind of a lucky shot of a crossbolt. Somebody shot what we might call a crossbow, right? They shot a bolt and it hit him. It wounded him, and he got infected and died from the infection. So that's how Richard died in 1199. So we'll talk about Richard more in the Crusades video, or if you've already watched the Crusades video, you'll have known about it. John, you might have heard of John before, right? John is usually portrayed as the bad guy in all the Robin Hood movies, right? Robin Hood was not a real person, by the way, but he is set the story is set during this period usually, right? But John is the younger brother of Richard, who becomes king after him. Richard did not have a son or daughter, and so John becomes king in 1199. And John is generally considered a big failure for a couple of reasons. He's a very powerful king, but he gets in disputes with the papacy. He's excommunicated for a while. He gets in disputes with the nobles and the church. There are basically civil wars, some going on in the time. And he ultimately loses control of all those French domains that I showed you on that map. So it's under John that the French king, who we'll be talking about, Philip II, essentially takes over all that purple area I showed you in that map before. The other thing that happened under John that was very significant was a document known as the Magna Carta. Magna Carta in Latin means Great Charter. It is a foundational document of English common law. The Magna Carta is significant because a monarch, a king, and really was kind of forced to do this. He's not like he really wanted to, but he, in a document, willingly limited his authority and gave the nobles and church officials certain rights and privileges. One of those rights for nobles, in fact, you might have heard of, is the right to a trial by a jury of your peers. That's actually sort of where that idea originated, or was really first written down in law. Again, there's the territory I was telling you about. So John loses all of this territory. Especially this northern territory is very significant. So Philip is able to extend the French domain over this area. Speaking of France, let's talk a little bit about them. French kings, going back to, I mentioned a king named Hugh Capet. I talked about that in a previous slide, who was elected king by the French nobles in about 987. Well, that started a dynasty known as the Capetians, Hugh Capet Capetians. And this dynasty was still the same dynasty to this time. And French kings had traditionally not been really powerful in France, okay? Even by the time of Louis VI, I give the dates here, he really only personally controlled that domain area that kind of surrounded Paris. And I'm going to be talking about Louis VII when we talk about the Second Crusade. He's in between these two, just so you know. But we'll be talking about him later. I want to talk about Philip. And this is Philip here. Philip will turn out to be a really significant French monarch and will greatly expand the power of the monarchy in France. Part of it because he does outwit John ultimately and gets control of that area. But he also extends royal control over many of the nobles and the church in France during the late 12th and early 13th century.